Then Walphana and Ekin, both from SCDAI, they'll also introduce themselves, obviously. We will be talking about multiple things today. My part of the talk, which is going to go first, I'm going to be focusing on white supremacy culture. I'm going to be focusing on a few different characteristics of white supremacy culture, giving you some ideas of how to start moving away from them. And then also talking about the role of mainstream media being also used as a tool of white supremacy culture. And then also just a small disclaimer before I start. I said I am going to be giving like these ideas to kind of like move away from these characteristics, but obviously it's not one size fits all. Like ultimately everybody's individual needs are different. Some people might even need like professional help or like, for example. So I'm not going to dive too deeply into that, but hopefully just being aware of these characteristics will also help to start that process of moving away from them. And if at any point I talk about these solutions in a very simplified manner, it's not because I think they're simple at all. I know that they're not simple. So, first of all, I want to start talking about the difference between reactive and sustainable anti-racism or activism. Reactive anti-racism is arguably not really anti-racism either. It is a short-term, highly situational form of solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, oftentimes comes from a place of performativity and centering one's own benefits. And it is also dependent on mainstream media, which is oftentimes what we see in the majority of people when their solidarity is completely dependent on the mainstream media news cycle. And then when we talk about sustainable forms of solidarity or anti-racism, it centers the needs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and it is also not situational. It does not depend on what is trending in the media, you could say. So what leads so many people to kind of falling into this reactive form of solidarity or reactive kind of anti-racism? Culture in itself is defined as, ideas, customs, social behaviors that of a particular people or society. So when we're talking about white supremacy culture, it is the same, ideas, customs, social behaviors, but the ones that all work to keep white supremacy in place and, maintain the status quo of power dynamics. It is literally the purpose of white supremacy culture to make someone feel as though it is impossible to change power dynamics or impossible to sustainably engage in anti-racism or other forms of social justice as well. So yes, today we're going to be talking about 4 different characteristics of white supremacy culture. And then while these characteristics are obviously detrimental to BIPOC communities, ultimately they're also damaging to white people, and they serve as obviously as a huge obstacle to people who want to practice anti-racism. And also, the way anti-racism works, the way white supremacy culture works, is that it instills these characteristics within people, kind of makes them go invisible, and then also rewards people who display them very strongly. And the characteristics we're going to be talking about were thought of by Tema Okun, who's an anti-racist trainer and activist in 1999. She has a list of actually, I think, 16 characteristics total, but, we'll focus on 4 today. The first one we're going to focus on is right to comfort. There are 2 points within right to comfort that I'm going to talk about. The first one being that it is the belief that those with power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort, even if this comes at the expense of the safety of others. So in this case, in this specific conversation, those in power would refer to white people. So I have a few examples, like to kind of get people to understand it better. I know that, for example, in the United States, a lot of adults are fighting against like their children or their teenagers being taught critical race theory in schools or being taught or being like truly taught about the transatlantic slave trade, meaning that they would prefer that their child remain ignorant to their own history instead of risking that their child would feel uncomfortable. Instead of teaching their child to learn to deal with that discomfort, because they probably also were not taught to deal with that discomfort. And obviously, we know that a person learning about injustice should feel uncomfortable. It is not something that it should be shied away from. But white supremacy culture teaches those in power that, in this case, white people, that their emotional comfort in the end is more valuable than even like the lives of others. It's also used by politicians when it comes to instilling fear into the public for specifically Black and Brown refugees. They shape the discourse to kind of make people afraid that if the Netherlands gives asylum to these refugees, this threatens their right to comfort by saying things like, refugees will take your jobs, or it's going to be a lot harder to find a house because they'll take all your houses, or they will force sexism back into the society. So these are just some examples of how this kind of also manifests. And then the second point within right to comfort is equating individual acts of unfairness against white people with systemic racism that targets BIPOC. And an example could be that, which is something that I also have often, is that when having conversations about systemic racism, a white person might bring up a situation in which they were treated really shitty by someone who is BIPOC, like they were cheated on or they were bullied or something like this. And obviously everybody's feelings are valid, but it's just another characteristic of white supremacy culture to equate your individual experience with these centuries-long systems that are built to oppress and kill BIPOC communities. And then when it comes to, how do you move away from this kind of right to comfort? Ultimately, you have to get to a place where you really understand and accept that discomfort is at the root of any kind of growth and any kind of learning, especially when we're talking about anti-racism, and getting to a place where you welcome it. Try to deepen your political analysis of racism so you have a stronger understanding of your role within it and how your personal experiences and feelings fit into this larger picture. Yes. And then yes, okay, so I'm going to go to the second characteristic that I'm going to be talking about, which is probably the most rewarded characteristic within white supremacy culture, which is perfectionism. Anything less than perfect is unacceptable. If you can't do it right, you might as well not do it. As I said, probably the characteristic in white supremacy culture that's most rewarded. And the reason being is that capitalism highly benefits from people being perfectionists, because perfectionism doesn't really allow someone to portray their full humanity. It pushes people to honestly kind of operate similar to how a machine operates, which is exactly what benefits capitalism, which is exactly why they reward you so much for it. So yeah, people are rewarded if they push themselves beyond their limits, if they neglect their needs in order to benefit like a company, and if they choose to live to work instead of working to live. And the reason perfectionism poses a huge obstacle in anti-racist work is because choosing to practice anti-racism involves choosing to really acknowledge and delve into your own imperfections and mistakes. And it often also involves realizing that it is literally impossible to reach perfection, and that honestly, we should reject the concept in and of itself. And a lot of people struggle with this and with the fact that, they would have to strive to improve, knowing that they can't reach perfection or knowing that they don't have like a quote unquote end point. And obviously, while causing harm to a BIPOC person is not an insignificant mistake at all, the whole point is learning to take accountability when you do, in order to cause less and less harm in the future. And this system of perfectionist mentality, which prevents people from engaging in anti-racism because perfectionism is impossible, just leads to avoidance, and it just leads to more harm being caused in the end. The second point within perfectionism is making a mistake is confused with being a mistake. Doing wrong is confused with being wrong. So, perfectionism manifests in many ways, even in small things. A lot of people are, for example, really hesitant to even start like a new hobby because, when you start something new, you're usually pretty bad at it. But yeah, in this kind of white supremacy characteristic, making a mistake is kind of seen as a reflection of who we are, which drives more and more people to want to strive for perfectionism, which again benefits capitalist systems. Because obviously, if the stakes are so high, if making a mistake means you lose value as a human, you will do absolutely everything to strive to become perfect, to prove your value. And again, some mistakes are not insignificant, but if you equate them with losing your worth as a human, it leads again to avoidance. People avoid anything that they may not be perfect at, including activism, including anti-racism. So, how do you kind of move away from this characteristic of perfectionism? I don't think any of this is easy. What I can say is a few things. I think it's important to kind of move towards a culture that is focused more on appreciation and acceptance. I don't know how we get to a point where we accept that mistakes are inevitable and accept that it's okay to take accountability, not that it's like insignificant to make a mistake, but it's okay to take accountability for those mistakes. And also some mistakes even lead to positive or useful learning opportunities as well, which is also important to remember. And when it comes to the second point of making a mistake being confused with being a mistake, I think it's important to remember, for white folks to remember that in anti-racism, you are not the center. If you make a mistake and equate it with, you're losing your worth as a human, ultimately, even if it feels really bad, you are still finding a way to center yourself, instead of centering the people that you may have caused harm to. So again, it's about learning to take accountability, acknowledging the severity of a mistake, fixing it if it's possible, and then trying not to repeat it in the future. And, it's normal to feel bad or regret or disappointed in yourself if you hurt someone, because this drives people to want to do better. But focusing your energy on how it makes you worthless, for example, is not only untrue, it's just unhelpful because, as I said, it leads to avoidance. And then try to change your mindset from, if somebody criticizes you, it being them versus you, and try to get to a place where you see it as this person is actually helping you because they're helping you achieve something you want to achieve, which is causing less harm to BIPOC communities. The third characteristic I'm going to be talking about is either or thinking. Things are seen as always, either or, good, bad, right, wrong, with us, against us. And this often results in trying to simplify complex systems of oppression. So, small disclaimer, I do think some things are either good or bad. What I mean is, there are a lot of situations where we cannot place people or situations in these boxes. That it's a lot more nuanced than that. And an example that I had was also a personal example from back in 2020 when the Black Lives Matter protests were going on in June, because that also happened to be Pride Month. And then I saw very regularly like white queer folks being vocal against it. And the reasoning that I saw was because they would argue that, well, actually, yeah, the majority of the Black community is homophobic or transphobic anyway. So, why are we fighting for them? That's the reasoning that I kept seeing over and over again. And yeah, this either or way of thinking in this situation leads to a few things. The first being it leads to the erasure and othering of a huge community of Black, queer, and trans folks. And Black trans women have shown to be even more likely to be targeted by the police than cisgender Black people. And it also completely obviously erases the intersectionality of the situation, meaning it does not center the liberation of the most marginalized, which are those who live within many different intersections of oppression, such as Black trans women. So, how do you get comfortable with not having to put things in these very neat boxes? Um, I think with everything, you should probably start small. There are probably things every single day that you try to box like this that you can kind of teach yourself to catch and to try to slowly move away from that. Um, Catch yourself when you try to simplify complex topics and instead do more research and understand the layers that are attached to it. And always, assume that something is an intersectional situation. Nothing is single-handed. So always have that assumption in the back of your mind. And then the last characteristic that I'm going to be talking about today is objectivity. I'm going to be talking about 2 points again. The first being that it is the belief that there is such a thing as being objective, which is oftentimes objectivity is equated with the logical thinking of cishet white men. Objectivity in itself is defined as a freedom of bias, favoritism, or emotion when, for example, making a decision or analyzing a situation. It's highly debated whether or not objectivity can ever really exist, since any human has an inherent bias and way of seeing the world that's influenced by their culture, their personality, media, etc., right? What is widely considered objective or logical thinking is usually the thought process of those in power, meaning cishet, upper and middle class white men. And then the second point is the belief that emotions are inherently destructive or irrational and should not play a role in decision-making processes. I have a few examples of this as well that I'm pretty sure we all know. But for example, when we're talking about racism, pretty often, if you're in a group of people, there is usually a white man or a white person in the room who decides to play devil's advocate. Meaning that they are simply there to kind of spark a debate and test the other person's arguments and see how strong their arguments are. People who are directly affected by racism or other forms of oppression are obviously emotionally invested in these topics, while those who play devil's advocate are able to view it from a far distance, and they see it as a fun little debate topic for the day. This often leads to emotionally triggering somebody who's from a marginalized community and who's pulled into these pointless conversations. And then also showing emotion in these situations or in the workplace inherently makes somebody's argument seem irrational. This is the case always, unless it is specifically white men who are expressing anger, because in those cases, they are seen as powerful or leaders. But if, for example, women show emotion, we're seen as irrational or unable to be leaders. And if, for example, Black men show emotion, they're seen as aggressive or, dangerous. The belief that emotion does not play any role in decision making, in my opinion, comes from the fact that historically, especially in Western countries, rich white men have mostly been the ones in positions of power able to make these decisions. And obviously, due to their position of privilege, they're easily able to remain distant and emotionless, even in situations that cause immense harm to groups of people. So I have a disclaimer about this as well. I think it's also, when we're talking about showing emotion, I think it's also important to mention that white people's emotions, their right to comfort, right, has been historically used as a weapon against BIPOC people. And it continues to be used to derail conversations about race or to center white feelings and white fragility. If you are having conversations specifically about race, it's probably a better idea to process the emotions that come up in that conversation, like guilt or shame, with like other white friends or relatives instead of putting it on your BIPOC friends. And yeah, how do we kind of start moving away from these characteristics of white supremacy culture? I think it's important to reflect on how does it show up in your life? You know, do you view others irrational if they portray emotion, or do you try to suppress emotion because you're afraid of being seen as naive? Do you play devil's advocate when it comes to social injustice? Kind of analyze how do these things manifest in your life, and then also once you figure it out, it's very individual. Try to find the resources necessary to kind of distance yourself from these characteristics. So, the role of mainstream media. Mainstream media are just traditional or established broadcasting and publishing outlets. So these are like the major channels in which the majority of people get their news. The reason I find it important to mention mainstream media is because of the massive effect it has on people's opinions and what we decide to care about. So once an issue has left the mainstream media news cycle, even if nothing has changed or, has been solved, people tend to move on and stop caring. And the lens through which the media decide to tell a story also has a massive impact. For example, during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 in the United States, mainstream media was incredibly selective of what they showed, and they decided very intentionally to focus on the riots that were happening. And whether or not the riots were good, that's a whole other conversation. But it was very intentionally selective on trying to portray the movement and Black people as violent. Meanwhile, there were also countless peaceful protests happening, countless situations in which the police were actually attacking peaceful protesters. But I had to learn about all of this through other channels, obviously. And then once the rioting stopped, the peaceful protests continued for a very long time, but there was absolutely no more mainstream media coverage. So these things are intentional methods to keep power dynamics in place, because ultimately mainstream media is also a tool of white supremacy. So personally, if I'm following mainstream media, I tend to ask myself a few questions. I ask myself, who is telling the story? So, like, what channel are you following? Who controls it? I ask myself, whose voice is being left out of the story? Are they intentionally leaving out marginalized voices? Are they being extremely selective with whose voices they amplify? I ask myself, how are they telling the story? Are they focusing only on certain aspects? Can you tell that they're promoting white supremacist ideals? And then I also ask myself, what are they gaining from sharing this story? Because there's always something in it for them, and they would never, promote something that is detrimental to themselves or to the people who control them. But yeah, who controls them? So these are some examples of people who are in control of mainstream media. You can see that, for example, the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, and you can see that they are all billionaires. I also know that the Los Angeles Times is also controlled by Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, which is also worth like $15 billion. Also, Time Magazine is owned by a billionaire. And these are just some examples. And these are some more examples. So, for example, the BBC is known as being, publicly owned and public funded, but they do still take huge donations from billionaires such as Bill Gates. And then these are two examples that are applicable to the Netherlands. The NOS, the chairman of the supervisory board of the NOS is a politician from the PvdA. And then the chairman of the supervisory board of the NTR is a politician from the SCDAI. So yes, the influence of mass media, obviously, as I said, has a massive impact on our lives, our individual views, beliefs, the way we vote, our knowledge about a specific topic. And yeah, billionaires represent the most privileged within our society who have had to use unethical and more often than not very racist methods to reach their level of wealth, such as modern day slavery, for example. And as owners of mainstream media channels, their aim will never be to make you question power dynamics or to make you see the full picture in regards to systemic issues such as classism or racism. And the same with politicians, who all have their very specific agenda, such as the PVDA or SCDAI. And then what I do, at least, what I know one of the most useful ways to use social media is to follow those whose voices are not allowed in the mainstream media. So actively try to follow grassroots organizations, BIPOC activists, educators, BIPOC media channels who already engage in this work on a long-term basis because their content does not depend on the mainstream news cycle. It depends on what is actually happening in these communities. And I have a list of people that you could follow.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the second part of the event. Mallika has already given us a great speech on understanding racism and white supremacy culture, and also how to practice sustainable anti-racism. So we thank again. Now we want to shift our focus towards higher education since our organization, SCDAI, Student Center for Diversity, Advocacy and Inclusion. We focus on higher education, so we will talk a little about that. My name is Ekin. My pronouns are she, her. I am one of the research coordinators at SCDAI since last year. I'm originally from Turkey, but I have been living in the last 8 years in different parts of Europe. And maybe, well, you would like to introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Walphana. I go by she, her pronouns. I am also part of SCDAI, one of the co-founders from the beginning. I studied at Hansa University, so I've been within SCDAI for I don't know how many years have it been now. 4 years. I I can't remember anymore. But overall, like we've been doing this for some time now, and yeah, I'm glad that we're able to have these sorts of events. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks. So in this part of the event, we want to show how racism and white supremacy culture can play a vital role before, during, and after a student's involvement at a university. And also, more importantly, we want to demonstrate how higher education can still be utilized to achieve sustainable higher education in these stages we mentioned. And in that sense, we want to position university or higher education institutions both as a barrier to and also provider of sustainable anti-racism. So let's start with entry to higher education. There is this understanding, I think you can all relate or understand what I mean, that universities are seen as, or higher education institutions in general, seen as left-leaning, progressive, liberal, inclusive, very diverse institutions, maybe shortly very woke institutions. And even though these global or nationwide discourses project higher education as a great equalizer that promises its students social upward mobility, the reality, there are still a lot of inequalities and social boundaries embedded within university life. And maybe quickly, I will explain what I mean by social upward mobility. This is about your class belonging, your social class belonging. The idea is that university education provides an upward, like if you're from working class parents or family, and you get a university education, and then you can study whatever you want, and then you work hard, and then you are going upwards, and then you're not working class anymore, you are middle class or upper middle class. So there is this understanding which I think I am very, very critical of. And why am I critical of it is because of the university's background. And we know that universities, they have a white supremacist past. And when I say past, I don't mean 300 years ago. Even we go back 70 years back, university students are privileged white men who belong to the elite or to upper middle classes. And these traditional barriers, they still exist today, even though the landscape is changing. They still persist in terms of economic resources, in terms of cultural or social, like knowledge poverty, lacking a certain know-how coming into the university, or lacking network. If you want to, we don't want to spend too much time on this at this very moment, but if you want to know more about this, the most recent podcast episode of SCDAI actually delves into this topic in detail. So if you go to our website and go to the podcast, the last one is about access, classism, and barriers to entry in higher education. So a little bit of advertisements on our side.
I also just sent it in the chat, so you can also open it from here.
Perfect, thank you. So what I said so far kind of explains the underrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in higher education. But for me, it still doesn't show the whole picture. Therefore, I think there is merit to talk about exclusion a bit more. And exclusion is a very, very problematic concept because it denies an individual's dignity by treating them just as an anonymous, interchangeable representative of an arbitrarily defined group. So think about being denied for a job or internship or a flat because of the skin of your color. And this is, we see this over and over again. There are groups that are excluded, that are denied access over and over again. And the social sciences scholar John Crowley says that these groups, they don't vary, especially in European context. These groups that are excluded and denied access, they are the same groups that are targeted by political xenophobia. So if in the political scene, the groups that are considered or drawn as dangerous strangers, let be it Asians, especially, given the current context, be it Muslims, brown people, Black people, migrants. These are the groups who are excluded and denied access over and over again. And Crowley says this leads to what he calls differential suspicion. So there are some people who are welcome by default, and there are some people who are trespassers until proven otherwise. And I think it relates to what Mallika said about right to comfort. Some people are by default, they are comfortable, they belong, and they do not have any suspicion about being somewhere. Sometimes this suspicion can also be internalized, and this, for me, ties back to the higher education. And maybe I can explain it via an example. For example, you are a student, you are a Dutch native. Your parents went to university, your siblings, your cousins, they all went to university. You have a lot of privileges economically. You don't have to work. You speak perfect Dutch and perfect English. The decision to go to university and study whatever you want. It comes very easy to you. You do not suspect yourself. But if your parents are migrants, or if you are planning to be a migrant for educational purposes, or you will be the first one to study in your family, even in your extended family, or you don't have the financial means to support your studies, so studying for you means studying and working, not only studying, it has to be working included. Or maybe your teachers at your high school, they didn't think you should go to university. They didn't guide you, they didn't support you in that. So you suspect that university is not for you, you know, or you are maybe weighing your options. Okay, I can go to university, but if I fail, the cost would be enormous emotionally, financially, or socially. So this suspicion already blocks people to try to study in the first place. This is, I think, a part of the underrepresentation. We cannot talk much because people already opt out before trying, because they think this is not for them. So this decision to study or not to study, it is not simply an individual motivational trait, but this is related to your socioeconomic and sociocultural background. And it is not that some people some people aspire to study and some people don't. It is that some people have the capacity to aspire and some people do not have the capacity to aspire. And this would be my point of tying this back to sustainable anti-racism. What we can do to fight these barriers to entry to higher education would be to create opportunities for people, when I mean people, the members of BIPOC communities, opportunities for capacity to aspire. And we have to, as a community, provide this economical, cultural, and social resources for those who might not have it. Now, I think that's more or less what I wanted to say about this. And Walphana, maybe you take over.
Yes. Hi, everyone, again. I will be talking about this part more about the importance of belonging in higher education and how higher education institutions can implement anti-racism practices and elements and etc. So before we actually delve into the whole shebang of everything, I want you to take a few moments to think about a moment in your life where you felt belonging and think about how that made you feel and what were the reactions from that feeling. So if you think of belonging, perhaps you felt a sense of security, acceptance, support, or inclusion. So I'm hoping that while you're thinking about your thought processes or keeping things in mind when we talk about belonging, I hope that you experience many moments of these. And yeah, as human beings, we crave belonging, and it's an important part for our development. So how does this tie in within the belonging ties in within the realm of higher education? Well, when it comes to higher education, sense of belonging, it refers to students' perceptions of mattering, feeling accepted, and valued in their environment. So it's also about the importance within the campus, like and how they perceive the supports they receive by their institutions. So in that case, in the realm of higher education, there is a strong correlation between students' sense of belonging in school and their participation, achievement, and general enjoyment of school. So in essence, when defining sense of belonging in education, we can include or exclude different measures or which tends to make it difficult to compare findings and build knowledge on that specific topic. But if we examine student belonging, we can propose this by assessing based on social sense of social belonging, academic support, and perceived institutional support. The first two, so sense of belonging and academic support, these ones, they're more about the psychological measures of social and social belonging. And while the third one, so institutional support, it encompasses like students, their own perceptions of what their institutional commitment is to them. So if you remember anything, that's like the easiest way to contrast them. So if we think about sense of social belonging, we can think about elements such as like, homesickness, cultural adjustments, self-authenticity. Um, so imagine like, when you go somewhere, I think it's a very natural component for us to feel homesickness. But if the feeling of this never derails, or you never get to a point where you don't long or crave to go home, then you don't have a sense of social belonging to the place that you are at. In terms of cultural adjustment, when we have a sense of social belonging, it's easier for us to adapt to the culture or interact with the people from the culture. And self-authenticity, that refers to, are we able to be ourselves? So think about like, when you're in certain dynamics, can you be yourself? Do you feel comfortable? Or do you feel as if somehow you have to mask who you are just in order to fit in or adjust? I think it's very natural for us to adjust to our surroundings, but there is a difference in between, like, when you are trying to adjust to your environment versus where you feel that you have to repress who you are as a person in order to fit into the environment that you are in. So that should give a more of an example of what sense of social belonging is. In terms of sense of academic belonging, that one, it refers to academic integration or the peer connections that you have. So if we can think about academic integration, like think about how your institution, like, you were able to facilitate that trajectory. Did you receive enough support? So you can think about like how, in terms like you coming to this, if you're international students, in terms of housing, did you receive any information of that? Or you can think about how your university, they helped you prior from getting access to a higher education institute. If we think about peer connection, that has to do with how do you interact with your classmates or your peers? Do you have a connection with them? Are you able to build rapport with them in class or outside of class? These are very important when we have, like, academic belonging for students. And the last one is the perceived institutional support. So think about the institutional commitment that your university has. Like, have you encountered a problem and you were able to go to your university and they were able to help you to this, even if it's not resolved? But did you feel as if like this is something that you could do? So if you think about the interaction that you have with your mentors, your academic counselors, study advisors for specific problems that it may not have to do with specifically in terms of education, but it also is a responsibility for higher education institutes to think about your own well-being. So you can think of that when it comes to institutional support. So in essence, we have, in terms of education, there's a strong sense of belonging that is associated with a strong sense of belonging. It's associated with positive academic attitude, motivation, a high level of engagement, and also academic achievement. So if we know that, then on the other hand, unbelonging would then be associated with negative emotions, depression, anxiety, grief, and loneliness. So in essence, how students experience belonging at school, it's highly significant for their present and future life, because sense of belonging is like, it's very persistent and it's a key element of integration. And we also say that belonging is a emotionally charged social location. And this entails that it's not only about a binary stretch of inclusion and exclusion, but it also has to do with modalities of inclusion that are decided. For example, if you say that there are no restrictions for BIPOC students to study at a university, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the BIPOC students, they will feel as if they belong to that university. And so therefore, universities or higher education institutes, they are tasked, or they're supposed to support and maintain spaces for belonging within students' everyday life, and also in to help them move towards to a more sustainable anti-racism. So I think like an example that I can give about like what exactly is the essence or the importance of belonging is I can use an example for myself because I am the one presenting right now. So when I think about my first 2 years within higher education, I often felt very isolated, like in my emotions and what I was experiencing. I come from Aruba, so a Caribbean island. If no one knows, we're very tiny, so I forgive you if you don't know. Um, at school, so coming to the Netherlands, there was a stark difference, like culturally, socially, from a lot of things. Like even though we had like similar things in common, but it was a drastic culture shock and everything. So it I had to get used to a lot of things, and were a lot of things that had happened at school that made me feel excluded because like there were certain remarks or ignorant questions by either students and teachers that would just get bypassed and were never really addressed. So I would be in class very often, and a teacher they would spew some, either racist remark or just microaggression, and in my head, I'm thinking at that moment, did anybody else hear that, or am I the one I'm just being sensitive to that situation? So that's how I constantly felt, and um, I call the first 2 years of no, actually, I call the second year of me being in higher education the year that I taught myself, because I didn't, I stopped going to school at a certain point because I'm just like, yeah, I'm not gonna deal with this every single day. I rather just like take note of the lectures online and then move on with it, because to me that felt more comfortable than going to classes and having to deal with a lot of people like saying things and then me questioning myself whether I was overreacting or I was underreacting. So yeah, to make this short, this was like a prevalent feeling of like unbelonging. So I felt isolated, and until something happened in class and there was a selective students, we kind of like band together and we started our own, what I would call essentially a venting session about how messed up things were. That was basically it. Like, there's no other way to put it. So we would gather after classes and vent, and these would happen to the times that I actually decided to go to school. So probably during mandatory classes, because I was not going to give them the satisfaction of failing me just because of that. So we're venting to each other, and then somehow venting, it turns to more aggression, more anger, and then the anger demanded more action, and then the action in general created SCDAI. So as what I'm representing right now. So essentially, SCDAI became the first place within higher education where I felt belonging and representation. And it was then when I understood what belonging actually meant, and it was something as well that I wanted for others. So that's like the little background story. But yeah, next, so talking about belonging and stuff like that, how can we move towards sustainable anti-racism in higher education? So there needs to be an integrative anti-racist approach which views education as a racially, culturally, and political experience, right? So in order to have equitable opportunities for underrepresented groups, higher education institutes, they must have awareness of how many groups have been historically excluded from educational opportunities, and how many have been marginalized within those institutional structures. So in essence, we have to look at there needs to be like a clarity based on language, goals, and measures for equitable practices. So it's important to clarify language, as often higher education institutes, they employ practices that are based on equality instead of equity. So that creates a problem for people who are not at the same standing or positioning. And additionally, it's important to clarify like data, or just like reports, like in a more user-friendly format, I would say, for staff administrators, in order for people not to be overwhelmed with the long process, because I think like for many of us who are just starting out, like overcomplicating things will not make us more engaging to it. So starting, if you meet people where they are and making it more a simplified version, then it's easier for them to interact with this. A second way that we can do this is that we can focus on equity mindedness, which means that it entails historical, political, exclusionary practices and racism within higher education, and understanding the effect that they have on underrepresented groups. So you kind of evaluate and go about it in the realms of equity instead of equality. Another point that we can do is that we can employ more equitable practice and policies that accommodate students based on their context of their circumstances. So practices and policies should incorporate tools that inquire how to help underrepresented students instead of remaining under the mainstay of equality. So again, going back to the point that equality is not necessarily the way we need to approach things, but with equity. Another point is we have to understand that equity is not a linear process, but it's about continuous learning. So therefore, it's important to establish continuous learning of disaggregating data and questioning assumptions about relevance and effectiveness. And you have to keep on doing this, because like it's never going to be a moment where you stop, because like at this moment we need to continue questioning what we have in order to get to a place where people feel that they have their rights are being met, or that they feel belonging within higher education. Another aspect is that equity should be a normative standard from resource allocation, assessment, and strategic planning. Thus, sometimes traditional strategies, they need to be evaluated, and equitable opportunities can be targeted at different levels and assessing the different needs of different individuals. So I think like, in general, we can see that within these points, like equity is like a very important key element in all of these principles or points. So on the screen, you can see like, I have like these 8 points that kind of encompass all of these what I just talked about. So focusing on student staff needs, respecting valuing the identities of all individuals, reevaluating inequitable systems or structures, involving all concerned groups, because you cannot practice sustainable anti-racism if you're not involving the groups who are marginalized or underrepresented. Continual learning, so that's about the having systems or structures that allow for us to reevaluate um, or continue to learn in these processes. Having policies that are based on equity, challenging traditional Eurocentric sources. This one is like it's more in depth, but if you want to learn more about this as well, another shameless plug. We have an article on our website. You can where you can learn about this more. And lastly, clarify equity in all practices. So I want to talk about here, like, so we talked about how higher education institutes can employ certain things that are more aligned with sustainable anti-racism. But when we take a look of what is happening in higher education, can we say that they are implementing sustainable anti-racism, and how would we be able to tell if that was happening? If you take a look at the websites of many higher education institutes, you will encounter many vision and mission alignment statements that include sustainable society, sustainable future, sustainable in operations, sustainable in education, sustainable in research. But the main component of this is that um, sustainability is very important in that it's as a key factor. And I can guarantee you, like, if you go on any website of higher education institute, you will find the word sustainability. No doubt in my mind. But how exactly does within, like, when mission alignment, it's supposed to be that this should reflect the soul of the institution and its core purpose for a definite time. However, in order to assess this, often higher education institutes, they lack comprehensive reviews of university policies and procedures that conflict with non-discrimination and inclusion clauses. And there is also a lack of definition for diversity, and diversity is often viewed in demographics, profit, the body of services, and programs offered to either staff or students. And there are often reactionary inclusion policies that serve the needs of the institution instead of the students. Like Mallika already explained with what exactly reactionary racism activism is. So basically, when you look at the mission alignment, they reflect these points instead of actually what sustainability should look like. Sustainability would be more, it should be reflected like in the programs, in the policies, and the practices that are supported. So how exactly do we move on from this? And one way that we can do is like we can have inclusive education that also encompasses sustainability. To have a fundamental objective education is to prepare students for sustainable lifestyles during and after their education trajectory. So therefore, having inclusive policy should also be sustainable to individuals for their development and equitable learning opportunities. So what I want to do as a last point is to just present like, some main sustainability takeaways that we can learn from. So in the beginning, I talked about what exactly sustainable anti-racism can look like in higher education. So what are the key points? So we think about like, the clarifying of the language, the focusing on the student needs, reevaluate existing inequitable systems and stuff like that. So the way that we can have sustainability, it's to include different parties and have policies and strategies that reflect the needs of the students. So a way that we can do this is one is through recruitment. You can recruit undergraduate or graduate students who are interested in anti-racism education. And that is something that's very much possible. There are plenty of students who are willing to do this, and hint, hint. Another form is to have to form relationships with alumni or staff who are interested or engaged with anti-racist work. That's also a collaborative opportunity for higher education institutes. A key component that should be involved in higher education is that we need to develop a curriculum that focuses on anti-racism education. And a way to do this is that one, you need to implement topics and learning opportunities in probably in the first year that is in accordance to the anti-racist framework, and teaching this also to teachers and having them develop more sources that are not so Eurocentric, but that challenges these norms. Another aspect is that we need to explore the equity gaps in education and make an actionable plan to resolve them. So without this, we're not able to move forward. Another point is to establish departments that can help students and continue to invest in anti-racist resources. We need to also train and support staff and academic counselors in how to work with students or how to work with others. You can also implement collaborative anti-racism workshops with students and staff, which is very helpful because then you're involving both parties and they can get more understanding of what the other situation is about. Another point is to promote different faculty anti-racism work on different levels at the university. This one is very important because, like, as we know, in higher education institutes, there's a lot of bureaucracy. So a lot of times, if you have like people on top who are part of the executive directors, executive board, or whatever, they implement policies and practices that kind of needs to be trickled down, and often the people that have like the most knowledge about what exactly goes on within the universities are people who are the supporting staff. So you need to be able to have anti-racism at the level for supporting staff, but also at the level for higher people who are at the higher ups, because they often are disconnected to what exactly is happening and they have no relations with students. So if they don't have relations with students, how can they exactly get an understanding of what they need to do? And lastly, we need to include an anti-racism as a measurable criteria for faculty to review, because this without this we cannot improve. And as I said before, it's about a continuous learning process. So we need to have a look, like, what is effective, what is actually working, what is not, to improve the the education trajectory for students in a more optimal and positive way. And yes, that was it for my part. I will now pass it over for Ekin, and she will explain to you more about the university's role in media and discourse.
Yes, exactly. Actually, the next slide is very much in line with Walphana has talked. Maybe we can just say a couple of more words on it. But yes, if a university is only talking about about diversity and inclusion on their mission statement, the chances are that your average student, your average white student, or BIPOC student will not pick on that. It will not help them. I mean, it is nice to have this mission statement, but commitment to anti-racism should be continuous, and it should be in all conversations. And of course, this could be very uncomfortable for universities. Again, we are coming back to right to comfort. For me, it is such a useful concept. And with its antidote being, okay, if you want to grow, if you want to learn, make peace with being uncomfortable and realize, like as universities, realize your racist, sexist, and classist past, and do something about it. So universities have this power and privilege, and if they are willing to get out of their comfort zone, they should strive to distribute this power and privilege equitably. And this power and privilege and how to distribute it equitably, it actually is very easy for universities, because they have this great ability to create and maintain different discourses, and they have various ways. And what I want to see from universities, that their dedication to diversity and inclusion are narrated in all those ways. And here I would invite you all to think of all these ways a bit more creatively, not just university as just one institution, but please think about it like university has a public image. They have publications, they have academic publications, which inform sometimes social policy. It informs the science. They create course content and curriculum. They have their website. They have advertisements. And they have also job advertisements. They have their newspapers, magazines, blogs, and some might even argue that architecture tells a story, which could be sometimes a racist or colonialist story. Sometimes, there is like colonialist architecture. Sometimes we see also in university building, but also about in decoration. Think about the artwork in hallways in university, or in the university's hallways, or in the dean's office, or in the rector's office. And I was really thinking about this, and I was imagining a rector's office, and I was not seeing paintings of black bodies, brown bodies, and I was seeing somehow something else. But then I didn't have to imagine, and now I will share the next slide with you. These photos, I hope you can all see quite clearly. They are they're fresh from the oven. I took them yesterday at the Academy building at the University of Groningen, because I was there for a PhD defense. A friend of mine defended her PhD, someone who is, by the way, a woman of color. And I was her paranymph, so I was with her, helping her out. And that was the room. These photos are from that room where they made us wait right before her defense. And I don't know if in the pictures you see a pattern that I am seeing, or like Walphana said, am I the only one seeing this? That these are all there were, I don't know, 20, 25 portraits of older white men, and that was the place that you had to wait before your defense, which was, by the way, of course, all the opponents were also white men. And for me, this was such a contrast between the mission statement of the university and then how they showed in the real life how, you know, what we surround ourselves with. So I would invite universities to be more aware of all these different opportunities to create a discourse. And I would maybe invite students to be more aware of these things. And if you see a hallway and pictures of these people, maybe make a note of that instead of saying that, oh, okay, these are some professors or scholars or whatever. So this is, I wanted to share, and it's fit perfectly just by chance that I saw it. And finally, I wanted to make a point about the more and better partnerships. So universities should provide spaces for partnerships. And I feel like this event is also a perfect example of it. I am assuming Mallika and Walphana, you also got to know each other, or GFN and SCDAI, they maybe, you know, the university played still some role, maybe not that actively, but the university should support that kind of partnerships so that this is continuous. I think there was an event last year, there's an event this year, and maybe we will have an event next year. And this is exactly this continuity that is very important, not just some reaction to a racist incident, but it is continuous. So I think there is a role that universities, media, and discourse to play. Yes, and moving to the last part of our presentation, thank you all so far bearing with us. We come to the after part. So what happens after a student is graduating? How do racism and white supremacy play a role? We already talk about, you know, academia's racist, sexist, and classist past, and we already talk about students' sense of belonging and in how it correlates to their academic achievements. And I just recently read this study which just rubs salt into the wound, but we will maybe talk about some antidotes as well. So this is a very recent study from 2020, and it is about the Netherlands, and it's about the educational expansion, or sometimes called massification of higher education. So, you know, having a university degree used to be a very rare thing that was only, you know, reserved for the most privileged, but it is now very, very commonplace. And some people were concerned that it will have negative effects on educational quality and the labor market value of a degree. So this study, it's a statistical study, and they found actually no negative effect of higher education expansion on graduate skill levels or the unemployment risk. That means university graduates, they still get a lot of skills through their education, and they are much less at risk of being unemployed. However, and it's a big however, there were effects on graduates with lower grades, women, and graduates with non-Western migration background. So these people, they were not unemployed, but they were earning less than their, you know, less than native Dutch men, graduates and graduates with better grades. And I was a bit disheartened with this research, but then it really provoked me to think about how can we turn this knowledge into an opportunity. What could be that we see, okay, there is a racist tendency, what could be done? And I thought about a couple of things. And one of them is BIPOC knowledge. So we can take charge of our own narrative, and we definitely have to focus on our this BIPOC knowledge as an intercultural competence. This could be that you are bilingual, or you speak another language, you speak multiple languages. This could be that you have experience living abroad, or you have, you know, you can shift some cultural codes very quickly. So this could be one way that we can fight this anti-racism, anti-racist employment preferences. And another antidote, I was thinking of transferable skills, and I would again say maybe we change the narrative around skills. Skills are things that you are simply good at. Maybe it shouldn't be something that is scary and big. And transferable skills in that sense basically mean the skills and traits that you perform in one setting that are useful in another setting. And I will give a quick example. And as you know, non-German speaking person, when I was studying in Germany, I couldn't find a very, you know, well-paying job, and I was working in a kitchen as a dishwasher. And I was thinking very lowly about this job, and I didn't think it, you know, provided me any skills. However, recently I realized that there are still transferable skills that I gained. For example, being stress resistant, because, you know, you are really racing against time when you are working in a kitchen. You have to be very dependable, and you have to be such a quick learner, especially in my case that I didn't have any training. They just put me in the kitchen and I had to somehow navigate, and so on. So I would encourage you all, maybe in our audience, there are some people who are looking for a job, or who are recent graduates, or maybe they will graduate soon. Please don't be disheartened by the study I mentioned. And the last point I would say is networking. And exactly, this is a great example of it again. You all here joining is amazing. I think this is also a step forward for sustainable anti-racism, to be just connect with like-minded people, people who look like you and who maybe feel similar struggles. So on that note, that would be the end of my points. Hope you can all follow what I am saying and so on. And we will open the floor for discussion now.